The Crusades and the transformation of the medieval knightly class. The Crusades, a series of religious wars waged between Christians and Muslims from the late 11th to the 13th centuries, had a significant impact not only on the political and religious landscape of medieval Europe, but also on the social structure of the time, particularly on the knightly class. The knights, who were initially warriors bound to the feudal system and the service of local lords, experienced a profound transformation during and after the Crusades. Their role in society, their military practices, and their relationships with the church and secular authorities were all shaped and redefined by their participation in the Crusades. This article will explore how the Crusades contributed to the evolution of the medieval knightly class, laying the groundwork for changes that would influence European society and warfare for centuries to come. 1. The emergence of the knightly class. Before the Crusades, the knightly class was largely shaped by the feudal system, which defined social and military relationships between lords and vassals. Knights were typically noble warriors, often with the responsibility of protecting their lord's lands and enforcing his will. Their military duties were part of the feudal contract, in which a knight pledged loyalty to a lord in exchange for land or other privileges. The primary role of the knight during this period was to fight in local skirmishes or defend territories within Europe. However, by the end of the 11th century, the concept of Christian chivalry began to take shape, which encouraged knights to act in the service of God, following a code of conduct that emphasized honor, bravery, and protection of the weak. This shift in ideals was influenced by religious fervor, as the Catholic Church began to promote the idea of knights as holy warriors, whose battles were no longer solely for personal gain, but also for spiritual rewards. The First Crusade, 1096 to 1099, marked a crucial turning point in the evolution of the knightly class, as knights were called to take part in a religious war to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim rule. 2. The call to arms, the impact of the First Crusade. The First Crusade was a defining moment for the medieval knightly class. Pope Urban II's call for a holy war in 1095 framed the crusade as a sacred duty, with promises of eternal salvation for those who participated. The idea that knights could gain spiritual rewards by fighting in the name of Christianity and for the defense of holy sites resonated deeply with the medieval knightly ethos. For many knights, the opportunity to combat the infidels in the Holy Land was a chance to prove their worth, secure their place in heaven, and gain honor and prestige. 2.1. Transformation from local warriors to global crusaders. The Crusades marked the first time that knights from different parts of Europe, France, Germany, Italy, and England were united under a common religious cause. This shift from local, feudal conflicts to large-scale, international campaigns represented a transformation in the nature of knighthood. The Crusaders became global warriors, bound together by a religious mission rather than by feudal allegiances or territorial disputes. As knights traveled to the Holy Land, they were exposed to different cultures and military practices, which influenced the development of medieval warfare in the West. 2.2. The rise of military orders. Another key development in the transformation of the knightly class during the Crusades was the rise of military orders. These orders, such as the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, and the Teutonic Knights, were religiously motivated military organizations formed to protect Christian pilgrims and defend the Crusader states in the Holy Land. The members of these military orders were often drawn from the ranks of the nobility, further strengthening the connection between knighthood and religious devotion. The military orders were not only instrumental in the Crusades but also became major political and economic players in Europe. They accumulated wealth and land, and their members were expected to follow strict codes of discipline and chivalric behavior. These orders reinforced the idea of knights as religious warriors and shaped the development of the knightly class for centuries to come. 3. The evolution of chivalry. The Crusades contributed significantly to the development and codification of chivalry, the code of conduct that governed the behavior of knights. Chivalry was initially a somewhat informal set of expectations, but the religious nature of the Crusades encouraged the church and secular authorities to formalize it into a more structured system. The ideals of chivalric behavior, loyalty, courage, honor, and defending the weak, were enshrined as virtues that knights were expected to uphold not only in battle but also in their interactions with others. 3.1. Chivalry and the Church. During the Crusades, the Church sought to ensure that knights adhered to a moral code that aligned with Christian principles. The Church's influence on the knightly class was reflected in the emphasis placed on spiritual rewards for knights, such as indulgences, forgiveness of sins, for those who participated in the Crusades. The notion that a knight could fight in the name of God, and that their actions on the battlefield were a form of religious devotion helped to solidify the connection between knighthood and the Church. At the same time, the Church sought to mitigate the more violent aspects of knightly behavior. The Crusades reinforced the idea that knights were not only soldiers but also protectors of the Christian faith and its values. This belief laid the foundation for the development of the just war theory, which would later influence the conduct of knights in medieval society. 3.2. The decline of feudalism and the rise of professionalism. The Crusades, particularly the later ones, led to the gradual decline of the feudal system as the knightly class became more professionalized. The need for large, organized armies during the Crusades forced European monarchs to reevaluate the feudal system's reliance on vassals and land-based military service. As monarchs began to centralize their power and raise standing armies, the reliance on the feudal knightly class diminished, and knights began to take on a more specialized role. The rise of mercenaries and the increasing use of professional soldiers reflected the shift away from a knightly class based on land ownership and feudal obligations toward a more militarized society where fighting was seen as a profession rather than a duty tied to land or social status. Four. The knights as symbolic figures. Following the Crusades, knights remained important symbolic figures in medieval Europe. Though their role on the battlefield diminished in the centuries that followed, the ideals of chivalry continued to shape the knightly class. By the 12th and 13th centuries, knights were increasingly viewed as symbols of honor and virtue, and their social status became more tied to their adherence to the code of chivalry rather than their ability to fight on the battlefield. In the later medieval period, the knightly class took on a more ceremonial role, becoming a prestigious title granted by monarchs or rulers. While the military function of the knight was still important, particularly in the defense of feudal territories, knights became less involved in large-scale military campaigns like the Crusades and more focused on maintaining their social status and upholding the principles of chivalric virtue. 5. Legacy of the Crusades on the knightly class. The long-term effects of the Crusades on the knightly class are still evident today. The transformation of the medieval knight into a religious warrior with deep connections to the Church and the rise of chivalric ideals became central aspects of Western military tradition and cultural identity. The Crusades laid the foundation for the way knights and military orders were understood in the centuries that followed, particularly during the Renaissance and the early modern period. Even though the Crusades eventually ended and the knightly class began to lose its military importance, the concept of knighthood persisted in the form of orders of chivalry, which continue to exist today. These orders, such as the Order of St. John, Knights Hospitaller, and the Order of the Garter, still embody the ideals of chivalry that were established during the Crusades. Conclusion. The Crusades had a profound and lasting impact on the medieval knightly class. They transformed knights from local feudal warriors into global crusaders engaged in religious warfare. The Crusades reshaped the social, political, and military role of knights, contributing to the development of chivalry and military orders while also laying the groundwork for the professionalization of warfare. Though the role of knights as fighters gradually diminished, the ideals they represented, including honor, courage, and devotion to God, continued to shape European society for centuries after the Crusades had ended. Banda NOI. Teep. ChatGPT da NOI. The Crusades and the transformation of the medieval knightly class. Continued. 6. The decline of the Crusader states and the shift in the knightly role. As the Crusades came to an end, particularly with the fall of Acre in 1291, the Crusader states in the Holy Land slowly disintegrated. This decline had a direct impact on the knightly class, which had been fundamentally shaped by their role as defenders of these states. The loss of Jerusalem and other key territories effectively brought an end to the Crusades, but the military orders and knightly classes that had been established in the Holy Land continued to play crucial roles in European society. 6.1. The post-Crusades world and the role of military orders. Although the military orders such as the Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller lost their original territorial bases, they remained powerful forces within Europe. The Templars, for instance, had become wealthy and influential, owning vast lands across Europe. When the order was dissolved in the early 14th century by Pope Clement V, it marked a turning point in the history of the knightly class. Many of its members and traditions were absorbed into other military orders, notably the Knights Hospitaller, who continued their work, albeit in different capacities. The Knights Hospitaller, after the fall of Acre, relocated to Rhodes and later to Malta, where they continued to defend Christianity against the Ottoman Empire and other Muslim powers. Their role shifted from being primarily military conquerors to becoming defenders of Christianity through their naval power and military strategy. This redefinition of the knightly role continued into the Renaissance, where knights became more focused on ceremonial duties and cultural roles rather than military conquests. 6.2. From warriors to statesmen. In the aftermath of the Crusades, the once militant knightly class began to transform into a more diplomatic and political elite. The knightly class's role as warriors began to wane with the rise of standing armies, the professionalization of warfare, and the development of gunpowder weapons. By the late Middle Ages, knights were no longer the sole military force in Europe, as monarchs relied on professional soldiers and mercenary armies. However, the knightly class had evolved into a symbol of aristocratic power and social status, with knights serving as advisors or courtiers in royal courts across Europe. This transition is especially evident in the Renaissance period, when the concept of knighthood became increasingly honorific. Monarchs granted knightly titles to their loyal supporters, and the act of being knighted became an important symbol of royal favor rather than military achievement. The knightly orders continued to function as symbols of noble lineage and Christian virtue, especially in the Order of the Garter, founded by Edward III in 1348, and the Order of the Golden Fleece, founded by Philip the Good of Burgundy in 1429. These orders celebrated ideals of chivalric honor, often in the context of courtly love, and became institutions that transcended their original military purpose. 7. The lasting cultural legacy of the Crusades on the knightly class. Even as the Crusader states disappeared and the military role of knights faded, the legacy of the Crusades continued to influence the knightly class and broader European culture for centuries. The values of chivalry, religious duty, and honor that emerged from the Crusades